Okay, looks like we are live. Welcome to, I appreciate that, Professor McQueen, as I am from Canada. So I am live from Canada. Welcome to Standing for Truth, everybody. This is a live program with me and Professor David McQueen, our team geologist here over at Standing for Truth Ministries. Now, I know everybody was expecting a debate between David McQueen and Ryan Adler on Noah's Ark. Specifically, the question, is Noah's Ark feasible? Now, we are still going to be doing that debate. Ryan, unfortunately, has had some unforeseen circumstances come about today. So we're going to reschedule for either the end of December or mid-January. But with that, we're still live right now for a show that will consist of an open mic dialogue. We're going to have Professor David McQueen. He is going to be giving us a 15-minute presentation going over his new book that he and Mrs. McQueen are working on and that I'm excited for, and I know everybody's going to be excited for as well once they see your presentation, David. While David's giving his presentation, I've posted the link, the join link, in the live chat. So anybody who wants to join and have a live interaction with Professor McQueen, whether it's a challenge, an objection, an argument, a criticism, a question, bring it live and we'll have some fun. So with that, David, how are you tonight? And what's going on?
Doing well. I'm assuming that my opponent's going to watch this. God is in control of somebody running over a telephone pole in his neighborhood and knocking out his internet connection. So he and I will pick it up another day. One nice thing that Donny has allowed George and I to do over the last year and a half is to have a little fun at the beginning of our time. And so let me start the fun with my Christmas tie that I entertain the grandchildren with. Listen to this. Can you hear it, Donny?
Oh, yeah.
So
One
that
of my
starts
favorite songs.
And then we want to go on to some humor. How do we know that Father Christmas, or Santa Claus here, was not on board the ark? There could have been 9 people on board the ark instead of 8. Well, how do we know that? We know that because there was no chimney on board the ark, so Santa couldn't get in there, even though they were in the ark for a full year. Since Jesus hadn't been born yet, obviously there was no Christmas on board the ark. But
it's good to know that Santa. It's good to know that Santa survived the flood, though, Professor McQueen.
Oh, it is. And I was talking to the grandchildren about how Santa intends to come to our front door this year, and they said, my younger grandchildren said, "Well, Grandfather, why?" And I said, "Well, he's put on some weight since last year, so he can't come down the chimney. He's got to come in the front door."
Perfectly understandable, brother. So I appreciate the humor and the Christmas spirit. December is flying by, and Christmas is going to be here before we know it. So, David, as always, it's a pleasure, brother. Actually, before you go, David, let me just remind the audience again, I've now pinned the link, and the link says for evolutionists, for critics to join. So whether it's Noah's Ark, the Genesis flood, bring your challenges and objections. We'll have some fun. So, David, over to you.
Okay, my time shows as 20 minutes after the hour, and so I'm going to make myself note to stop at 35 minutes after the hour, and then we'll go on to our discussion. If my fearless leader in Canada is pleased, at the top of the hour, which I guess for us will be about 10 minutes after the hour, if he's pleased, we'll go an additional 30 minutes. So let me go ahead and write down this 35-minute break here and take me to the full screen, and I'll talk about forensics in rocks. Ms. McQueen and I have been challenged by our publisher in North Arkansas that published our first book. He has challenged us I'll use this broken cue stick. We won't go into how it got broken in my house. I'll use this as a pointer. How do you talk about rock forensics? Well, our new book is due out this next year in 2023. And I've got the pointer right on one of our granddaughters, full name Eleanor Alice, but we call her Alice in the book. And what Alice does is she goes about looking at rocks. And there you can see her in her skirt and with the rock hammer there in her hand. And she goes about looking at rocks. And so we ask her a forensic question. Alice, is this a mineral like quartz or is it a rock? How do we know that something like this is not a naturally occurring? Were they playing pool on board the ark? Could this have dropped off the ark? Our family pool games are famous, sometimes resulting in things like this. But at any rate, how would you know that this is man-made instead of natural? And so we can go on and on. What if they were to find one of Grandpa's boyhood marbles out in the grass? How would you know that that is natural or man-made? What if something is just one color, like this specular hematite here? What if it's got more than one color in it, like this? There's a rock with several colors, several minerals in it. If you go out in your backyard, Alice, and find one of your brother's toy tanks, is that man-made? Is it made by God? Is it pre-flood? Is it post-flood? Let's look at some of the questions that we can ask. And we can dispense with the pointer there. Ms. McQueen very much likes this idea of challenging our granddaughter as we go about looking at rocks. What lens do you want to use to look at the rocks you find? Do you want to use the lens of man's story, talking about evolution, old earth, or do you want to use his story? And Alice, notice that his story is history, or history. Do you want to look at the true history from the Bible, or do you want to look at man's story that begins with an old earth? Which lens do you use to look at things? And so as we go out with Alice in our book, we start out in Alice's backyard. And we go out and we look and we see perhaps a brick, or we see soil. Maybe we can find a rock that looks kind of like this, a small pebble. If it's rounded like this, do you think it fell off an outcropping, or was it rolled by water? And so we want to ask our granddaughter Alice a couple of important questions. Here's an example that I can give. We can ask Alice this question. There's Alice pointing here on this side. Alice with her shovel. Does a rock have a barcode on it? Does it have a short barcode indicating that it might be young, or an old, long barcode indicating that it code, I can get it out, indicating that it's old? No, of course it doesn't. And we teach in the book what the word forensics means. So what does it mean to talk about rock forensics? Well, many of the children, certainly the high school students and many of their parents, may be interested in such TV shows as NCIS, National Naval Criminal Investigation Services, NCIS, or maybe they like true crime TV shows, their parents, where you go in and look at the evidence of the science of forensics, what DNA might teach us. Donny could answer that about the DNA that we see. But what about other things? Whose fingerprint do we see on the murder weapon? And then, as we have developed an outline for our new book, we want to come to this very important question. When our granddaughter goes out and sees a fossil-bearing rock, what crime was done to result in most of those fossil-bearing rocks? Let's think about that for a minute. What crime was done to result in most fossil-bearing rocks? Who was the criminal? Who was the judge in this crime scene? Well, we want to teach our granddaughter, Alice, to go to God's Word to find the answers for some of this out. Since my viewpoint, for those of you that might be new in this standing for truth and might not know me, I am a professional geologist, someone that believes that the earth is young, the universe is young, 6,000 years, and that the Bible is a trusted document. Ms. McQueen and I, a couple of months ago, celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. So we went over to a paraphrase of the Bible called the New Living Translation. So let's look back and ask ourselves the question, what was the crime? Where was the crime scene? Well, if you have your Bible, you can turn with me to Genesis chapter 6. And I have over on one side a King James version that I can double check with. But listen to the wording of Genesis 6, beginning with verse 5, in this paraphrase. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. As Ms. McQueen and I worry about the impact of social media on our 10 grandchildren, we worry that before they're ready to understand things that are evil, that they might be very quickly exposed to a situation where the human wickedness, and I'll add the internet into this, on the earth portrayed everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. The imagination and thoughts of their heart were evil. And if you drop down in verse 7, we see why the fossil-bearing rocks, the rocks predominantly from Noah's flood, constitute a crime scene. Notice what God says in verse 7. And the Lord said, I will wipe out this human race I have created from the face of the earth. Yes, I will destroy every living thing. And so the estimates that have been made by my colleagues in creation science about the number of people that could have been alive at the time of the flood range from 150 million by the researcher named Jan Petschkus, who writes under the nom de guerre, nom de plume of John Wood-Morripy. He feels that there might have been as many as 100 million people alive at the time of the flood. Dr. Henry Morris did his calculations in the 50s, wrote about them in the 1960s, and his number was 1 billion people alive. So let's take the smaller of those two numbers. What evidence do we have that 100 million people were destroyed by a flood? Well, let's get some time markers in there so we can understand. If you go to the book of Genesis and you look all the way up to chapter 12, you'll find a discussion of Abraham. Bible archaeology tells us that Abraham lived 2166 BC. Let's go ahead and just round that number to 2,000 years before Christ. And so if we're saying that the earth is 6,000 years old, we got 3 units of 2,000, around 2,000 years from the time of creation to the time of Abraham, from Abraham to the cross of Christ and the resurrection of Christ, another 2,000 years, and a bit more than 2,000 years to us today. And so in round numbers, we've got this 6,000 years. But what's the nature of the crime? How can we know that there's some criminal activity? Well, the most conservative date that goes back to Bishop Ussher and others for the time of the flood is between 2518 and 2517 BC. Let's go ahead and round that to 2,500 years before Christ. And so that's the time of the Great Flood. That Great Flood saved the lives of 8 people. 8 people on board an ark of this shape that was 300 cubits, turn it this way, 300 cubits long, a barge with a beam of 50 cubits, and a height of 30 cubits. It turns out that when Ryan and I do get to debate, I'm going to present quite an interesting argument that this ratio of 30 to 300, this 1 to 10 ratio, is a very stable object, a very stable floating barge that contained the animals and Noah. Now, if 8 people got off the ark and 8 people were saved in the ark from a flood that lasted a full year, how come we don't routinely find human fossils associated with dinosaurs and elephants that could have escaped the time of the flood? And so, as I like to use models, since we're talking about a children's book, here's a T-Rex and an African elephant. Ms. McQueen and I have looked up the weight of these things. An African elephant like this in the Smithsonian, around 5 tons, maybe as much, a little bit bigger than that. A T-Rex, perhaps 8 tons. But it turns out, how come we don't routinely find Noah's cousin here and all of these other animals wrapped up in a huge flood deposit, and he's one of the 100 million people that got killed? Well, the answer that I would give to that is that early on in the flood, everybody that had a boat that lived in a coastal area got on that boat or fled to the high mountains. And so the humans were able to escape the rising floodwaters for probably the longest period of time, but they were not alone. The African elephants would have scampered across the one world continent and went up as high as they could, as would the dinosaurs. And so these animals could escape the longest during this great aqueous catastrophe that we call the Great Flood. Now, ponder that for a second while I take a sip of coffee here and think about what this means when it comes to a crime. And so we're asking, what crime was done to result in all of these fossil-bearing rocks? What crime was done to bring about the judgment of Genesis chapter 6? Why would God have said this? The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth and saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. Now, that's quite an indictment. That's an indictment of a righteous judge on a population of criminals that committed terrible crimes. It says in this paraphrase, it broke his heart. And the Lord God said, I will wipe out this human race I've created from the face of the earth, saving only the 8 people on board the ark. I would say that this is a horrendous crime scene, and one that, whether you're little Alice, the character in our book, or an adult, need to think about the crimes that you have seen in the 21st century, and whether, from a standpoint of a forensic analysis, we could find who the criminals are and who the judge is. There is no justice in our modern world. Scripture predicts that it's only in the final judgment of God that we will see clearly who the criminals are, and all the forensic evidence in the book of life and so forth will be opened up and all of our deeds exposed. I would think that would give us some food for thought. Donny, I'll give it back to you while I drink some more water here.
Amen, Brother McQueen. Well said, and the perfect way to set up the show for tonight. So you've earned that drink of water and a drink of coffee a little later too. So what we'll do is, since I promised one of our favorite critics here in the chat, Dave, I promised that he would get the first question. And so I'll put the first question up, Professor McQueen, for you. And it is related to the flood and the ark. And so Dave H., he's got a question for you. He says, okay, David, you mentioned that everything died millions. Everything died millions. So with all these corpses, so I'm guessing he's saying millions of corpses,
right,
would therefore be rotting. How did any animal, including dinosaurs, get all around the world with nothing to eat?
Okay. Dave, I very much appreciate your question. And let's answer that with a look at the historical record. Now, we'll come to a moment about why we don't routinely find human corpses in the uppermost part of the fossil record. But the last part of your question illustrates some potential ignorance on your part, Dave. How did any animal get all the way around the world with nothing to eat? Well, we need to look over in the historical record in Genesis chapter 6 and find out what actually happened. I'm reading from Genesis 6 from this paraphrase. And God says to Noah, I will confirm my covenant with you. So enter the boat, you, your wives, your sons and their wives, so the 8 people, Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, into the boat to keep them alive during the flood. And then here's the key, 20, verse 20. Pairs of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, every kind of small animal that scurries along the ground, will come to you to be kept alive. Be sure to take on board enough food for your family and for all the animals. And so Noah did everything exactly as God had commanded him. So we can get to even more questions. I'll abbreviate my response to that and how I write it up on the whiteboard behind me here. The first answer to your question is that in this pre-flood world, which as a flood geologist, it's one world continent. If you're familiar with the words Tethys Sea from modern geology, this would be the Tethys Sea here. So this is the sea here and Gondwana land and so forth. Since most people in our modern world live within a 1 day's drive of the ocean, I'm assuming that the population of the Earth, all these 100 million people, were in this coastal region here. And so when the Great Flood occurred, let's say that and no one knows where the ark was in the pre-flood world, but let's put an X there. And so let me grab a different color and illustrate that what we've got going on here is that animals from all over the world came to Noah in groups of 2. We will say more about this when we debate in the future, but I'm going to say that there are about 8,000 genera of air-breathing animals, or 16,000 when you make that a pair, came to be on board the ark. And God gave Noah well over 100 years to hire people to gather the hay and the grain and all that kind of stuff that these creatures would eat. And that was all on board the ark. And so they didn't have to walk around the earth to get to him, Dave, as you suggested. God brought them there to Noah. Okay, you want to follow up on that, or is that enough for that particular question?
That is thorough. And since it's live, and if Dave H has any objections in the chat, feel free to present them, Dave, and I'll put them up on screen. So here's a super chat that came in. I've got a couple of my own questions for you.
Okay,
Professor
good.
McQueen,
I'll look forward to it.
But you know what? We'll get the super chat up here first. So I do appreciate the support from Pure Aussie Gold, the support for the show. So he's got a $10 super chat with a question, and question is for you, Professor McQueen. He is asking, what are Professor McQueen's thoughts on the hydroplate theory?
Okay. For those of you that are unaware of a creation scientist that I knew 40 years ago as Colonel Brown, his name is Walt Brown, and Colonel Brown was part of ICR back in the 70s. He was actually in charge of the Midwestern Institute for Creation Research unit handling Chicago and that area. Colonel Brown came up with an idea early on that the subterranean water, and like I usually do, I'm going to draw a tree here to illustrate that I'm drawing a cross section. Dr. Brown, Colonel Brown, to me, came up with this idea that in the pre-flood world, there were enormous bodies of water that were subterranean, and that when Scripture teaches about the breakup of the fountains of the great deep and this water being ejected high in the air, part of his idea is that in 3 dimensions, this subterranean water would form what he calls a hydroplate theory to explain the movement of the continents and so forth. In the last 40 years, I have talked to Colonel Brown on the phone. I've read his book, and I don't find his argument as good as the argument of Dr. Baumgartner, Andrew Snelling, people like Dr. John Morris, even my own research about the breakup of this one world continent. I don't find it compelling. Pure Aussie Gold, I appreciate your interest in it. We'll continue to study it.
Very good, David McQueen. I appreciate your response to that question. And Dave H. did send in a follow-up response clarifying. So he says, David, what I meant was after the flood, what did they eat as the animals migrated around the world? So I guess if I could reword it a little bit, you have the year-long flood, the ark animals leave the ark, but since everything died outside of the ark and nothing is left other than carcasses that are rotting, what would they eat?
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And that requires me to redraw this to answer your question in more detail. Okay, so the flood occurs and these creatures are killed. And the study of how animals die is called taphonomy. And one of the things that has been observed is that when humans die, especially when they're drowning, there's a constriction of your throat. And so for a certain period of time, you've got air in your lungs. And in this flood environment, we'll put the ark over here. And then here we have what began to be a column of, in my model, 10,000 feet of water. But these human bodies are actually floating up here for a while. And were there any aquaria on the ark? The answer is no. And so out here in the ocean were everything from blue whales, the weight of 33 elephants, down to mosasaurs. Let me get this working here. Mosasaurs, there are sharks, there are all kinds of carnivores. And so the reason that there was no need for these creatures to be on board the ark is that God, as part of his judgment, knew that these creatures were going to eat the millions of humans. And as the floodwaters went on, there were situations where tens of thousands of fish were killed in certain areas. So one reason that we do not find these creatures in the fossil record is that they were consumed. Now, let's go to the second part of his question, his clarification, and that is, once the ark lands, and I'm going to draw this as a map view. Here's a north arrow. Here is eastern Turkey, the mountains of Ararat. So the ark lands there. Everybody gets off. They begin to reproduce. We come all the way up to Genesis 11, where God forces mankind into two situations: the origin of language and the migration from eastern Turkey all over the world. And so the way that I explain this when I'm lecturing about it is, over here you've got a group of people that say, Buenos dias, Feliz Navidad. Well, they wouldn't have said that because Christmas wasn't there yet. But Buenos dias, ¿cómo está usted? And so they're talking, and they come up to this guy, and the guy says, what? Wie geht es Ihnen? Was sagen Sie? And then they come to somebody, well, I'm speaking English. What word are you saying? And so naturally, the speakers of Spanish go over into this area and they talk to their buddies. And the Germans go to their part of this area in eastern Turkey, and they're talking to people that can understand them. And then the English speakers go over. And so the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, in other words, Noah's great-grandchildren and so forth, they then begin to move across the earth. Now, keep in mind that the Tower of Babel occurs not that long before the birth of Abraham. If Abraham's born in 2166 BC, and when we do the subtraction back to 2517, and we round some of these numbers up, we've got 400 years there of people reproducing, and over the earth, as someone has commented, fresh grass is growing. And so as these three broad groups of people, the descendants of Ham, Japheth, and Shem begin to move northeast, south, and west, they're moving with a purpose. Noah may have turned to them at a certain point and said, oh, look at these things that jump around on their 2 feet. You know that Adam named these to be kangaroos. Why don't you take them to the east? And then he turns to others that are dealing with elephants, for example. He said, why don't you ride them down into Africa? And Japheth, you head up to the caves of Eastern Europe, and we'll send you some dogs and some cats to keep you company. So there's no problem with what they ate as the flood was going on, nor is there a problem with what they ate during this essentially 400 years worth of grass growing and so forth. Next question, Donny.
Now, if so, here's Dave H. Dave will pretend that you're doing the debate right now. So he says grass is growing, but that takes time and loads of animals can't digest grass. What would be a good response to that?
Okay. The response would be this. As a student of World War II history, I know that the lions and tigers in the Berlin Zoo were no longer fed were no longer fed meat from about 1942 on. And so what did the German people feed these animals, keep them alive in the zoo? Well, they fed them grains and potatoes and carrots. And so even though they were carnivores, they could eat these grains. And so a modern lion or tiger, and World War II, we're talking about less than 100 years ago, these creatures ate grains. And my former boss, Bob Gentry, had a beautiful German Shepherd that he loved, and that creature was raised on a vegetarian diet, kind of a Seventh-day Adventist German Shepherd. And so, at any rate, the creatures that we identify now as carnivores certainly would have attacked some of these other animals that had moved from the ark and eaten them, no doubt. But they didn't have to, you see. They could have eaten the grains and so forth that were provided.
Thank you, Professor McQueen. Here's one from Born Again RN that's on the same topic.
Yeah.
So Steve Christie is the name of Born Again RN. Thank you so much. His question is, where does it say in Scripture that grass, plants, and food needed to grow slowly, since Genesis describes all of this growing instantaneously?
Okay. I have a son-in-law that's a male nurse here in Mississippi, and so I appreciate all that you have to say there. As an RN, let's divide your question into two parts. Let's divide it into a pre-flood part and a post-flood part. So what you say is certainly true when it's talking about going back to Genesis chapter 1. In this pre-flood time, so we'll call this pre-flood time. Going back to Genesis 1, it's true that God, as he created the plants for the animals in the 6 literal 24-hour days of the creation week, it is true that he provided the grass and the plants for the food for the animals to eat in this pre-flood world, in the world of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, because during that time there was no sin in the world. A diagram that's helped me, Born Again RN, over the years is a diagram that I was taught almost 50 years ago. If you diagram Adam and Eve in the garden, and I'll draw sad faces on their face. If you diagram them in the garden, whenever they fell, so I'll draw it this way. So they enter into sin by disobeying God. At that moment, all the animals, I'll call that A, they were still above them, so to speak. They were still unfallen. And so God had to bring the animals after the fall underneath the dominion of Adam and Eve. And sadly, that began to bring in carnivorous carnivorous animals. Now let's go to the post-flood world. So let's go over here. This is the pre-flood or antediluvian world. Let's go to the post-flood world, and let's look after Genesis chapter 11, after the Tower of Babel. So you've got the configuration of our modern world, where this would be the Mediterranean, Med Sea, and then this would be Europe and Israel here, Africa down here. And you start drawing the modern geography as the migration moved after the Tower of Babel. Get another color out here. So you've got these humans going all these different places where the animals had gone before. And so they were not moving into a vacuum, but they were moving into an Africa that already had what would technically be called fauna and flora there. And sadly, Scripture clearly teaches that these creatures were eating each other, but also eating grass and other things that they could find in that post-flood world. How long have we been going now, Donny? Are we at the 1 hour mark yet?
No, we're doing good. We're at about the 46-minute mark.
Okay,
And
good.
so what I'm going to do here is bring in, now that we've answered a few of the audience questions.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what your question is, my friend.
What I'll do is save my question as a finale, as I'll bring in our guest that's in the back room. And I just want to change the template here. Why don't we do... Okay. So with that, we have Grayson, who is of the evolution persuasion.
Okay.
And Grayson's been here several times now for formal debates. I've debated him a couple times at least. He's debated Kent Hovind, and he has some debates scheduled in the future. So Grayson, thanks for joining the open mic discussion. And why don't you give yourself a real quick introduction and then present a challenge or objection or a question to David McQueen.
Hey all, I'm driving, so hope there's not too much background noise, but I haven't been able to hear the entire talk so far. I was just going to ask, I guess, one of the big questions that I have with a lot of these flood models, like I was going to ask Kent the next time that we had a talk, but one of the things that is my biggest question is just how to explain the order that we find in like the fossil record from like, you know, the more complex organisms on top and the less complex organisms toward the bottom, and we see these ordered layers of different organisms, and you know it all seems very, you know, sorted. So what is the explanation in the global flood model creationist view for this like sorting of the fossil record that we observe?
Grayson, first and most importantly, I want to wish you Merry Christmas, and I thank you so much for being part of this debate with the spontaneity of the driving. Be sure to turn your headlights up to bright, because some of the things I tell you may shock you. I don't want you to wreck or anything like that. A little bit of driving humor there. Your question is a very important one, and one that I've thought about for 40 years. And so let's look at this whole issue of the fossil record. And what I'm going to do, Grayson, is I'm going to draw a cross section that John Woodmorapy, or Jan Peskus is his real name, the fellow that's been a friend of mine going back 30 years at least. He has found one area in the country of Morocco, in the Atlas Mountains. And so here is here's Morocco in northwest Africa. And there is a place there that you can begin in what the evolutionary community calls Precambrian. And you can walk up the side of this mountain, apparently. For those of you that need a refresher on this, carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian. And then you keep on going and you find two Johnny Clock, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous with a K, and then you find modern, even what a flood geologist would consider modern rocks there. And so in the study that we have done, this is the only place on Earth that you really can walk up from the Cambrian through the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. So let's use this as an example, because this would be a perfect place to prove the truth of evolutionary science. Well, as you go, and I haven't done it yet, but some of my buddies have, as you walk this outcrop, it is true that, and then I'll draw it in a more traditional way, in the Cambrian rocks, you really do find trilobites. Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. In the Devonian rocks here, you really do find fish fossils. And then you keep going up, and at a certain point, you encounter dinosaur bones or dinosaur graveyards up here, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. Now, as a flood geologist, I didn't draw that very well. This is Devonian and Cambrian. What we see here is what is called, what's come to be called over the years, ecological zonation, habitat zonation, where if the flood occurred, we would expect, as the floodwaters ran off that one world continent, a geologist would expect things like trilobites and fish, gastropods, plesiopods to be buried first. And then as the flood proceeded and the waves went for that 12-month period, they would then capture the creatures that could escape the longest, like dinosaurs, and then finally man. Keep in mind that one of the mysteries that I continue to look into is why we do not find routinely where we find dinosaur fossils. Why don't we find dinosaurs, elephants, and man all jumbled together? I don't have a quick explanation for that, but Grayson, for the audience that's listening to our discussion here, that's actually a very important point, isn't it? If I'm trying to do science and you're trying to do science, there are certain things that you cannot explain, like how these fossils appear abruptly and fully formed. And there are certain things I can't explain, like the absence of human fossils. What do you think, Grayson?
Well, I do agree that your model maybe can't explain those things, but I do think that we have an explanation for the things that you said that we don't, like the Cambrian explosion and such. But I one last thing while we're talking about the sorting, you were talking about how it could be different habitats or different like mobility strategies, but what I wanted to bring up was plankton fossils, which would be all living in the same habitat, right? Like phytoplankton in the first few meters of the Earth's surface where they can get sun. They would all the different types of phytoplankton would be occupying the same kind of ecological niche. They would be all kind of the same density, the same kind of complexity in body structures, the same ability to be mobile, like pretty much the same kind of properties. I don't know how you distinguish different types of phytoplankton, but they are distinguished in the order that we find them in the fossil record. Again, going from this more complex and more diverse different types of specimens of phytoplankton towards the top layers, and then more basal and less complex and less derived specimens at further down layers. So I don't know how the sorting of specifically plankton, because, you know, same amount of intelligence, same habitat, same, you know, everything along the distinguishing characteristics for flood sorting. So how could we explain the specific ordering of like plankton fossils? And then if you want to talk about like the Cambrian explosion and those kinds of topics, I'm open to that discussion as well, because, you know, I think that stuff is really interesting. The short answer, what I would just point to, is that the Ediacaran fossils clearly show, like, you know, that things are not just popping up out of complete nowhere in the Cambrian.
Okay, let's start, Grayson, with your phytoplankton argument. And you and I really, in February or March, should have a debate, just you and me, because the points you bring up are important. Let me use an example from the Gulf of Mexico. If this is the delta of the Mississippi River, I live about here, 5 hours north of New Orleans. But I've spent quite a bit of time studying from my University of Tennessee days. I got my undergraduate degree in 74 there and then went on to Michigan in 79. In those years, I studied the issues of the Gulf of Mexico. And let me give you a counter argument that comes from one of my University of Tennessee professors, who was a very aggressive evolutionist, someone who had no interest, zero interest in my creationist views. And there's a story behind that. But his name was Dr. Walker. And Dr. Walker was my stratigraphy professor. And he told us this that has stuck with me over the last 40 years. He said, McQueen, if you go to the Gulf of Mexico and you look at phytoplankton and foraminifera going down the column, and I'll simplify this into three parts here. This will be the surface of the Gulf of Mexico, and we'll call this Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. If you look at these rock units, it is true that you find phytoplankton, that I'll use a P for here, and it's true that you find foraminifera, and there are different kinds. Geologists that have worked in the petroleum industry in the Gulf of Mexico have found for years that if you go down about 1,000 feet and you follow a certain type of foram, many times you'll find crude oil below that unit. Well, here was Dr. Walker's take on that. He said, gentlemen, in my class, I'm telling you that these forams and these phytoplanktons might as well be screws and bolts and paper clips. This is coming from an evolutionary geologist with a degree from Yale. He said, as far as the evolutionary side of this goes, there's no clear evolution of these forams. There's no clear evolution of this phytoplankton, like Grayson's saying. It might as well be a group of screws, bolts, and nuts and so forth that you find there for all the evolutionary significance they have. So it is true that about 1,000 feet down, you find a bunch of forams and phytoplankton that are like screws. And then underneath that, you find some others that are like nuts. And then underneath that, you find paper clips. And over the years that the Gulf has been drilled, going back 70 years to the 50s at least, and then back into the 40s, as they worked offshore, pragmatically, they have used these fossils to identify crude oil areas. I'm guessing you don't like that argument, Grayson.
Well, I'm not sure how up to date that argument is. I mean, you were saying that this professor was saying these things back in the 70s, if I heard you correctly. And
oh, yeah. He was, it was in the 70s that he got his doctorate, I think.
Well, I think that the field has progressed a lot since then in 50 years intervening. I mean, for example, the period preceding the Cambrian explosion, the Ediacaran was only became an official named period in geological history in 2004 or something. So a lot of our knowledge about Precambrian fossils was most developed in the 90s and the early 2000s, and we started to re-examine a lot of the fossilized fauna that we had from that period, and seeing the similarities that they had with later life, like trilobites or those kinds of things, and just in comparison with the body forms, and seeing the great diversification and flourishing of life that we see in the Ediacaran period.
Let me suggest to the to the audience that's are listening to our debate here that Grayson may be committing a logical fallacy that I've seen among a number of younger scientists like him. Just because something's old doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, if I understand Grayson's philosophical viewpoint, he thinks that Darwin in 1859 came upon a very clever idea about natural selection. So just because something's old, even in the evolutionary community, doesn't mean it's wrong. But let me give some defense to this based on the Ediacaran fauna in the Lower Cambrian. In about 1976, a scientist named Preston Cloud came to the University of Michigan to give us a lecture about the Ediacaran that he had been studying in southwest Canada, I guess. And he talked about these very interesting jellyfish fossils, and he had some ideas of some trilobite precursors that he felt he could trace into the Cambrian. And so I raised my hand. This was a brown bag discussion. Back in those days, I was a National Science Foundation graduate fellow, so I had some clout in the department. They didn't understand how a Southern boy like me even got that scholarship, but they gave me some leeway. And so I asked Preston Cloud about this whole transition from the Ediacara up into the Cambrian. And I asked him questions like, how come the trilobites that are found in that part of Canada appear abruptly and fully formed? Well, he fumbled around with some answers, and one of my favorite professors, Eric Cassine, has now passed away, and he was my metamorphic petrology professor, quite a friend of mine. He came up to me afterwards. He said, McQueen, I've got to caution you. I know you're a Christian. You got to think about these Friday seminars as kind of like Sunday school. You don't embarrass the Sunday school teacher by asking questions like that. You find that humorous, Grayson?
I don't really know exactly how to respond to that, other than just the fact that, like, Cambrian trilobites are hard-bodied animals. So I mean, they have like shells or things that would fossilize easily.
But you do know the name Preston Cloud.
Let me just finish this sentence really quick. But in the Ediacaran period, we know that the fossils that we're finding are much rarer because they're from soft-bodied organisms. So like the paucity in fossils would make sense because they're only forming under much rarer conditions that would trap soft-bodied creatures and cause them to make impressions that would then become fossils. So it's like a slightly different between the hard-bodied animals that we see evolving in the Cambrian. So that would be an explanation for what you're saying is this sudden appearance out of nowhere would be the development of these more hard shell forms.
Well, I did mention jellyfish, and the issue that you brought up, I think you should communicate with Donny between now and the first of the year, and let you and I set up a debate in February or March and tackle some of these questions. Now, tell me a bit about your background. Are you a geologist, Grayson?
No, I'm not. But yeah, I am really interested in discussing this question of sorting. I wasn't exactly satisfied with the explanation for the photoplankton. And then I also just have the question of course, where are all of the humans in the flood layers that we see these dinosaurs and these Cambrian fossils and all of them in? We never find any humans in those layers. So where would that be? Because shouldn't we find them if isn't that would be in your model?
And in your critique there, if it really is true that there were 1 billion people or even 100 million people, one would think that we would find more human fossils. An Australian colleague of mine named John Mackay has tried to do research on a human fossil that was apparently found in the Western Hemisphere that ended up in the basement of the British Museum, fossilized. If you look at old photographs of the British Museum in the pre-Darwinian days, 1820, 1830, 1850, this was on prominent display as a human killed during the time of the Great Flood. And so I can point to one or two examples, even one that I did some research on in Peru back in 1997. So they're one or two examples that I can point to, but your critique is quite challenging. How come, since those of us that are flood geologists have been looking at this since 1700, how come we haven't found more of these worldwide? It's a legitimate critique.
Could you mention the first example that you mentioned, something about the British Museum with a human fossil that was found and displayed before Darwin? But then, so are you alleging like there's like a conspiracy to like suppress this human fossil, or has it been renamed, or like is it
no?
Just where is it like today? Is it just like hidden and it's cloistered off in the basement, or like has it been relabeled? What's the story with that?
The King Crocoduck, if you listen to our debate, he too accused me of conspiratorial ideas, and I'm not talking about a conspiracy like the Masonic order went in with a group of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm not talking about that sort of thing. I'm just saying that in the period of time in the early 1800s, when a flood model was considered a legitimate alternative to an old Earth, or the idea of evolution wasn't fully developed when we get to 1820, but still it was in the minds of people like Darwin's relatives and so forth. My only point is that John Mackay has done the research on this fossil that was found by British geologists. I don't know when, I don't have that memorized, but they took the fossil to the British Museum in the time before the Darwinian idea became prominent. It was on display in the British Museum as an example of a antediluvian human that had been fossilized in the Caribbean. In Mackay's research, he's found photographs, and it's clear that up until, 1860 or something, this was on display. And when he himself traveled to London and asked the curators about it, they said, oh, yeah, a lot of those old things from the mid-1800s, we've taken them down. They've been replaced by modern, and they're down in the basement. That's the story, Grayson.
Okay, so it's just sort of like it's kind of fallen into obscurity, and nobody really has it's possibly in this basement, but it hasn't really been described in like a modern context. Because there were a lot of things that we were not aware of in the 1800s, and a lot of museum exhibitions that I'm sure would not be accurate to re-exhibit today that were from the 1800s. Because we know a lot more, especially with like different types of hominins and different, human like related like ancestors. So I'm curious if that would still be classified as Homo sapien today, or if that was, if there's any sort of reading I can do on this human specimen from the 1800s.
Now Donny can in private provide you with John Mackay's email address in Australia. I don't even know if it's private. Maybe you have it at your desk, Donny. I don't know. But you can contact Mackay, and I owe him a call to wish him Merry Christmas. I'll bring it back up with him Um, it's um, it's an issue that I would like to return to. I need to take a 5-minute break myself, Donnie, if I may, and get another cup of coffee. Um, Grayson, it's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'll turn it over to Donnie. If you'd drop my feed, I will come back in 5 minutes.
Okay, David McQueen. Once you get back, I've got a lot of questions saved as well for you to answer in our final 30 minutes. I do appreciate this first hour and 15 minutes, so time always flies by. So there you go. Feed is dropped, Professor McQueen. Grayson, I guess I'd have an interesting question for you. It would be based on the biblical starting point. I'd be curious as to your thoughts. The Bible essentially says, and we've debated separate ancestry now 3 times, about 9+ hours worth of debate. So I do recommend people check that out. But when it comes to not just the ordering of the fossil record, but why don't we really find human fossils pre-flood in the fossil record? Because we find a lot of fossils post-flood, right? Neanderthalensis, Erectus, Floresiensis, Naledi, Heidelbergensis. We find all of these human fossils, but we find them in layers above the Cenozoic, essentially, and therefore would be considered post-flood. Probably the result of post-Babel migration and the dispersal of people groups that became isolated and eventually buried to the point where we can find them today. But my question would be, would we logically expect to find many human fossils in pre-flood rocks, given the fact that Genesis tells us that God created 2 people, Adam and Eve? And so humans would have started as 2 people. But then the Bible is pretty clear that God created countless animals, millions and millions, one could say billions of animals around the globe at that time, which I would argue was a one world continent, the pre-flood one world continent. And so we would have millions of animals, but only 2 people basically at creation. And 2,000 years later at the flood, we would expect a lot of animals and only few people, especially when compared to the animals. So in the fossil record, we would expect to find what? Billions of fossilized animals, but little to no humans. It would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. It would really depend on where we're looking. It would depend on the mindset of who's looking, right? So any thoughts on that specific point, Grayson?
Yeah, I mean, don't you, as part of your model, have to think that the human species got down to like what 8 individuals after the flood, like with Noah and his sons and their wives? So then, and 2,000 years, if you're saying is the distance between Adam and Eve and then the flood, if we look at 2,000 years after Noah, that's like almost around the time of Jesus, and the world population then was certainly, pretty significant to at least have left behind bones. And so that's this, given the same time frame of the 2,000 years, just like in your same model. So I think that you could grow, especially, if you have a lot of abundant resources, like Adam and Eve probably would around Eden, then you'd think that they'd be able to grow a population. I mean, you can, increase increase exponentially on a population scale per generation. So, yeah, I think like the 2,000 years, I mean, it would be plenty. I mean, McQueen was just talking about potentially billions or like a billion of people pre-flood. So I don't know what the consensus is in the creationist community, but I don't really see an issue with 2,000 years not being long enough to build up a significant population to leave behind fossils.
So that's a good question and some good points. So we have creation. God creates Adam and Eve. And what follows the creation of Adam and Eve is rapid and exponential population growth, right? So in each biblical creation bottleneck, the creation event, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, which was in a way a bottleneck event, they were each one generation. So they were one generation bottlenecks, and they were followed by rapid and exponential population growth. And so after the flood, we for sure would have had a rapidly expanding population. Now that population would have been isolated because they did not spread out just yet until the Tower of Babel, when God confused their languages. Then they spread out into different parts of the globe. Okay, and that's where we can get into allele frequencies and Y chromosomal DNA difference distribution, things like that, which we have touched on to determine the validity of the Babel story in the Bible. But here's my point: is in the pre-flood world, although we start with an expanding population, once we get to the time where the Bible describes the pre-flood world as being incredibly degenerate, wicked, it has now descended into wickedness, and it talks about the world at that time being filled with violence, and the thoughts of every single man were wicked. That would tell me that the violence, the murder, the wickedness at that time might have made for a very small population. So it depends, I guess, on your creationist starting point or model in terms of the flood itself. Once you reach the flood, the human population could have been down to as little as 100 million, which definitely would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, especially if you have billions of animals essentially all over the planet in the pre-flood world. And then humans could have even been isolated in certain parts wherever their civilization is. So for me, it makes me wonder, at least starting from the Bible, where it talks about the pre-flood world being wicked, which is why God had to destroy it in the first place. And it says every single thought of man was wicked. And so to me, that might suggest the population was rather low. I mean, that would say people were not fulfilling God's command to be fruitful and multiply. So at that point, the rapidly growing population probably stopped. And if there was a lot of murder, violence, and wickedness, then that could have reduced the population as well. So I think it does come down to, and Grace, and I said a lot there, so I definitely want to get your thoughts before Professor McQueen comes back. So if you hold to a position, which I believe I would, where you have a population that isn't in the billions, that's maybe closer to 100 million. And so those people are buried. But then you also have billions of animals buried. We would expect today little to no human fossils, but a great multitude of animal fossils. And that's exactly what we find. So anyways, Grayson, what are your thoughts on that overall?
Yeah, I mean, the population for apex predators is never going to be approaching even hundreds of millions of numbers. Like apex predators, like a small number of them can exist over a large geographic territory, like big cats or something. You're never going to have like a huge, like 100 million number of like big cats or apex predators like T-Rex, and yet we find fossil evidence of apex predators all the time. I think 100 million or something, or even a few million humans is still plenty enough to leave behind evidence in the fossil records, which we don't really find for any of these layers below the Cenozoic, as you guys are putting the flood at. And then I would just say, if I was hearing lots of corruption and wickedness and violence, I mean, all the places with the highest amounts of all those aspects are urban, like cities. That's where the highest murder rates are. That's where the most corruption and crime and all that stuff is in cities, which would imply a larger population. I mean, the Bible uses a lot of kind of similar ideas to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah at later points. Describing them as pretty wicked too. So you have to have a decently high population to be able to have these big sinful cities and everything. So
I would argue that the nature of the flood, where you have, let's say it's about 100 million human beings at the time, mixed with the billions and billions of animals, that's where the needle in a haystack comes into play. Because if you have just a tiny percentage of life on the earth at that time being humans. And just the greater portion. And that's why in the fossil record, we mostly find marine organisms anyways.
But you're not addressing my point with the apex predators, which I said would not be in the billions or millions. There'd be a much smaller amount of apex predators, and we still have the fossils for them.
Yeah, but which specific apex predator would you be talking about? I know you mentioned
name any apex predator. Like you're not going to find any of them occupying the ecological niche of an apex predator at any large population numbers, like millions and billions.
Well, and that's the thing. In the fossil record, we really don't find a huge portion of any of these higher mammals, these reptiles. I mean, even if you were to look at how many fossils we have of like Spinosaurus, it's really only a couple, and then they extrapolate everything from that couple. Megalodon sharks, I think we've only got a few teeth, and that's pretty much it. And that's all that would be fossilized anyways. T-Rex, not really all that many anyways. When you look at each case independently, there's not really a lot to even go by per species. And that would go for your apex predator as well. Go ahead.
I definitely think that you're like underselling it a little bit, but then at the same time, we still find all of these things. We don't find any like human fossils below the Cenozoic.
Professor McQueen, good to have you back. Me and Grayson decided to continue the discussion in your absence. So it's good to have you back ready. It looks like I hope you're ready to box Grayson and not.
Oh well, I
don't know. I take you on, Professor McQueen.
I got excited on my break and opened up my shirt to show the red blood, and here's the boxing gloves. So it's time to take the gloves off. They're even everlast. Isn't that interesting? Time to take the gloves off and ask some hard-hitting questions in this final group, this final amount of time. Donny, I want you to help me pace myself so that I think that I ordinarily take a 5-minute summary as I get toward the end. And are you looking to go all the way to the top of the hour here? So another 30 minutes?
Yeah, we could definitely go to the 2-hour mark, since we have been having a good discussion here. I want to wrap up my points on what I was saying, and then I want to give Grayson the final word there, and then we'll move on to either another point that you have, Grayson, for Professor McQueen, and then we'll also get to some of these questions that come in. So I would also argue that what you're going to find, let's just say we have a specific apex predator and its population is 100 million in the pre-flood world at the time of the flood. And then we have humans that are, let's say, at 100 million. Okay, well, why don't we find some human fossils, but we do find some of, name your favorite apex predator, right? So again, we have a lot of isolated bones. We have a lot of fragments, but it's going to depend on where these specific organisms were situated too. And I know, I'm not sure, I think Professor McQueen holds to a version at least of the ecological zonation model. And
Correct.
So so that would basically explain most of the fossil record as being burial of specific communities, being burial of specific ecosystems and habitats. Okay. And in the scriptures, it talks about how the land of Eden, we're told that a river flows out of Eden. Okay. So we understand that rivers flow downhill, and therefore we would understand that Eden was at a higher elevation. But then we also know that certain dinosaurs, other types of animals, they exist on lower elevations, right? We have some dinosaurs that live in swampy lowland areas. And so you have various animals, various communities and ecosystems that are living separate from man. So it might be like comparing apples and oranges if you want to look at humans versus name your favorite apex predator, because if it really is burial by ecosystems and communities, then we're not necessarily going to expect to find equal numbers of, let's say, human fossils as we would a Tyrannosaurus Rex fossil or some of these mammal predators. But anyways, Grayson, have the last word on that issue, and then we're going to allow you and Professor McQueen to go back and forth maybe one more time on one more point.
Yeah, okay. Well, if that were true, then there would be sort of hot and cold spots of like finding humans. Like you would find no human fossils in the areas that you're saying like the other animals live separately of humans, but then you would find areas where you would find the human fossils concentrated, like where they were living. You're saying that if this is like a, if the fossil record is the result of like that habitat and the community of organisms that were there, then we would expect to find those human communities somewhere on Earth, which I mean, to point them out to me, I guess, because I'm not aware of them. And then just secondly, if that idea of, the habitats forming the fossil record was accurate, then how do you explain like where we have different habitats throughout geological time? So as you go higher up in the layers, you can go from like a desert or something to an ocean, to back to a land or like a forest or something, and you can see like the different plants and animals living there adjusting accordingly, but it's in the same spot. It's just the matter of depth. How could you explain that?
Okay, let me interject here, Donny, my take on this apex predator line of discussion that you guys have had. And let me begin it, as I like to do things, with a simple example. I live in northeast Louisiana, many swampy areas. I have relatives that live in the New Orleans area. And in my work as a hydrogeologist for the Louisiana DEQ, I traveled statewide during my 26-year career. And so I have been to places that I know were very rich in alligators. I've never seen one walking across the road, but I've seen photographs of it. I have been fishing with my buddies, not a big fisherman, a fly fisherman is my hobby, a fairly unsuccessful one, I might add. So I've been around the block where there would be alligators. I myself have never been in the right place at the right time to have one come close to me. But here's the point I want to make to you, Grayson. I don't choose to live where I know there are a lot of alligators. And so it's not exactly an apex predator that I want to even know about. For example, I hope, other than photographs, I never see a tiger or never see a lion up front. I spent a month in Zimbabwe, the new name for Rhodesia. So I was around places that were lion habitat. I never saw one. I have hiked over the years in the Rockies and the Appalachians, but I've never seen a bear in the wild. I have a son that's seen more than one, but not me. And so as far as the apex predator argument that you're giving is, I would say that most pre-flood humans, even if there were 100 million humans and 100 million apex predators of certain kind, I am quite confident that they would not have lived anywhere near to have been buried together. Now, I want to make one final point that Dr. Gary Parker has made to me over the last 40 years, and that's the issue of T-Rex. A lot of the argument, and let's forget about Hollywood for a moment, and their depiction of Jurassic Park and all that kind of stuff. Let's just talk about the fossil evidence for T-Rex. A lot of the argument for their predation is based on their teeth. Well, if you look at some very wicked looking animals like vampire bats, for example, what do they use their teeth for? Do they bite into humans and suck our blood? No. What they do is they attack mangoes and other fruits, and they use their teeth to get them out. Gary Parker's made the point over the years that if T-Rex really were to bite into you, all you'd have to do is pull away as a human, and his teeth were so shallowly cemented in his skull, you'd probably jerk his teeth out. Any of that ring true to you, Grayson?
Well, the first point I feel as if though I already addressed in my last speaking part, where I was saying that because Donny was the one that was saying that humans and the apex predators would live in different places. Although I will say I just brought up apex predators as a point of saying we do find apex predators that, like in the fossil record, I was showing that by comparison to human fossils, which we don't find below the Cenozoic, and to say that. Apex predators also existed in the low population numbers because that was what Donny was explaining the absence of fossils with. But aside from the fact of that was how apex predators originally was brought up, with your point and what I addressed last time was saying that you would find hot and cold patches. Like some areas you'd find more apex predator fossils, and some areas you would find more human fossils. But that's not what we find. We find the apex predators in the pre-Cenozoic layers, but we don't find the human fossils. So that's why I'm saying that just saying that they're segregated over geological areas doesn't explain what we're actually finding in the fossil record, which is just that there's no humans in the pre-Cenozoic layers. And then to your points about teeth, I would just ask, how do you explain like fossils of dinosaurs with like their stomach contents fossilized with, lizards or smaller dinosaurs, like in the stomachs of larger dinosaurs? Like, we can see some of the things that they ate actually preserved in the fossil record.
Okay, let me respond to that. Take the gloves off and we can duke this out, because what you're pointing out is actually clearly wrong in the sense of how logically you should think about this. Let's take your final point there. It is true that for example, Dinosaur National Monument that I've visited over the years and studied about in my geology field work, in environments like that where there are tremendous numbers of rapidly buried dinosaur fossils, the burial is so rapid and so exquisite that you can see the contents of their stomach. And so now I'd like to turn that argument back around on you and say, okay, evolutionary scientist, explain to me then, are you trying to say that this dinosaur laid there for 1,000 years and was buried, and we see no evidence of decay? We don't see any degradation of those stomach contents. You and Donny know far more about the population genetic sides of things, and so I'll defer to him on some of his arguments. But one thing that he said that I have to study more about is I just can't imagine that if the pre-flood human population was 100 million, that there might be 100 million of these apex predators around also. Now, Donny, perhaps I misunderstood what you were saying. Did I?
I think, and Grayson, you can clarify. I think I was just assuming for sake of argument, because Grayson was saying, well, if the human population was low during the pre-flood world, let's say 100 million, and that's one of the reasons why we don't really find any human fossils, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. He then compared that to an apex predator that maybe exists as 100 million in terms of population. Well, why do we find fossils of that specific apex predator and not humans? Is that right? Is that an accurate representation, Grayson?
Yeah, and I would think that 100 million would still be on the really large end of the spectrum for apex predator populations, because you have to remember, humans can have a large population because of agriculture. We grow our food, but an apex predator is dependent on just the local animals around them and what they can hunt. And so it's really, you can sustain a much, much smaller population, but we find them all the time in the fossil record.
Well, one thing I want to say is, though, we don't want to make the assumption, the uniformitarian assumption, and Professor McQueen, you can expand on this if you want. When we looked at ecosystems today and communities today that exist on this planet, remember, the entire real estate of the earth was completely changed at the time of the flood. And so ecosystems and habitats and communities in the pre-flood world would be totally different than what we see today. And so if you're seeing a specific apex predator in a population today, and you're looking at its ecosystem that it exists in, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's going to be in the pre-flood world as well. So the burial by ecosystems and communities from the pre-flood world would be different than the ecosystems and communities that we see today. Does that make sense?
Okay, so then what about for something like, to return to a previous example, phytoplankton, where they have to be like in the ocean somewhere in water, but they have to be close enough to the surface to get sunlight. That's what makes them phytoplankton. And
Right.
we find so many fossils of phytoplankton in the fossil record that there's just not enough room on the surface area of the earth. If it was a global flood and it was all covered in water, there's not enough room, like within those first few meters of like the sunlight's penetration into the ocean, for all of those phytoplankton that we see in the fossil record. They would, overcrowd the oceans even on a completely flooded world.
Donnie, I have a suggestion. Why don't we let Grayson take a 5-minute break and get some water? And you go ahead and give me one of the questions that has come in from either your brain, you said you had some questions, or the audience. And then Grayson and I can come back to it in 5 minutes.
And Grayson, I appreciate you joining for this open mic and having a solid 45-minute discussion on the ordering of the fossil record. Maybe we'll get a specific debate one day between you and Grayson, or even myself.
Yeah, I would enjoy that very much.
So the question that I'll put up on screen here is, let me see here, because I've got a few from the guests. So just to respect the guests, let me get a question in here from, well, I guess this question from Mountain Hours. I wonder what the population was before the flood. We did kind of touch on that. So why don't we touch on this one right here from Born Again RN. Thank you so much for your question and all the questions. As always, these programs do fly by. So Born Again RN says, are the rock layers pretty consistent around the world, having the same or similar kind of fossils? Wouldn't this consistency support a worldwide flood? By the way, young earth creationist here. So he's a young earth creationist.
Okay. My nursing friend, you've come up with a very important point here. And let me get rid of the T-Rex and Apex business here. And we'll talk about a couple of books that you need to buy to read in 2023 that will really help you in this understanding of what a geologist would call persistent facies, or certain rock layers that you can find worldwide. 2 books I would recommend to you is the book by Ager, Ager. I think there are as many as 3 editions now, but you can go on Amazon, and all of his books contain something like a title of The Nature of the Stratigraphic Record. Now, his work was picked up on by Dr. Henry Morris, Dr. Dwayne Gish, in their debating in the great debate decade from around 1970, around 1980. During those years, they used Agar's work routinely, because one of the points that he made in the book, that he makes in the book, is that You can start in Texas. You can start in Texas with the Austin chalk and then go all the way up and across the Atlantic Ocean to the White Cliffs of Dover. And then you can go from there all the way to northern Turkey, outcropping at the ocean there. And so here is Turkey, and then here is the sea, rather, you would call it. These chalks are white, and they consist of microfossils. You may have heard the term diatomaceous earth. So how come you can go from Texas to the White Cliffs of Dover to the northern coast of Turkey and find the same rock? Well, this is called persistent. And then the word that you may not know is facies, F-A-C-I-E-S. These persistent facies provide a wonderful argument for a catastrophic worldwide flood, but this is not the only example that we can give. My favorite all-time example of this deals, well, I need to suggest the second book. So this Agar book, Nature of the Stratigraphic Record, you should buy that. But also the creation scientist now working for ICR named Timothy Clary has written a book, a very important book, a big, thick book that deals with what would be called sequence stratigraphy. And you can go to the ICR website and find Clary's book, well worth the money. And he talks also about this. My favorite example, and one that I've used on Standing for Truth in the past, I've used this in my university teaching. It's a favorite story of mine, and I'll repeat it here. If we draw England as this big old triangle, then here's Hadrian's Wall and where my relatives came from Scotland, up here above Hadrian's Wall, and all of that area. If this is London right here, then this area is called Wales, Prince of Wales and all that, now the King of England. There was a man, Pastor Adam Sedgwick, Sedgwick. I'm not the best speller, but he was both a professor and a pastor. And he was teaching during the time of the growth of the British Empire. His students then went to India and America and Germany and all over the world, and they carried with them what he taught them. And this is how I imagined it happen, because I've been a university professor. This is the way I would have done it. So Sedgwick is sitting there and he says, we're going to go on a field trip to Wales, to the old area of the Cambry tribe, Cambri, Cambry tribe. And we're going to look at some red rocks there that have trilobites in them and a green mineral, called glauconite. And that's going to be the start of the Great Flood, because you see, Sedgwick lived in the years when at the university level, they believed that the Great Flood was the best explanation of things. And so year after year, he would write this. So at a certain point, he got a different color chalk. And he said, no, I'm not going to go all through this. We're going to call this Cambrian. And I'm going to show you lower Cambrian red sandstones and shales that have got the trilobites in them, got the green glauconite, and we're going to call that Cambrian. Okay, so year after year he did this. His students then graduated, and these students went all over the world. When they got to Tennessee, and they worked down the Appalachian Mountains to my home state of Tennessee, my home area of East Tennessee, they found some folded and faulted red rocks that had trilobites in them and the green glauconite. And they said, Shazam, Andy, look what we found. This is just what old Professor Sedgwick taught us to call Cambrian. And so there in Tennessee, where can I draw this? In Tennessee, you find the Cambrian rocks, just like he saw in Wales. Obviously, they're in Wales. Then you go to India, you go to China, you go to Africa. I've done field work in Germany. I've seen them in Germany. You go all over the world and you find these Cambrian rocks because Professor Sedgwick named them that way. So they're not Cambrian because they're 500 million years old. They're Cambrian because Sedgwick taught hundreds of young geologists to call them Cambrian, which was a reference to geography, not to evolution. And so the word Cambrian was carried worldwide. And I might add, the word Devonian is named for Devonshire, where fish fossils were found. And so Devonian fish fossils are known worldwide. In Germany, there's a group of 3 layers called the Trias, the Triassic. We find dinosaur fossils. These words were carried all over the world. It's not a conspiracy, as Grayson or other might try to accuse me of. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the history of the development of words like Cambrian, Ordovician, Triassic. These are all words coined by creationists. I hope that helps.
Very detailed. And I have to say thanks for the excellent questions there, Born Again RN, and to everybody in the chat. Do you want me to pick out one last question as we move to the 2-hour mark, David, or did you want to do your 5-minute closing?
Let's do one more question, and then I'll do my 5-minute summary and turn it back over to you, Brother Donny.
Okay, I appreciate this, David. I always enjoy these open mics. The last time we did this, specifically you and I, was when King Crocoduck had to reschedule. I think it was about a week later, and so we did an open mic. It was a lot of fun. So, okay, so here's the last question that we will engage for tonight. Comes in from Stephanie. Thanks so much for your question, Stephanie. Question for David. Could we build an ark today and repeat what those great minds did in the past?
Well, let me steal some thunder from what I'm going to debate my opponent about in the future when we finally get around to, is the ark feasible? With the help of a buddy of mine, I, not being a great mind, but someone that believes the Bible, actually cut a 2x4 into a dimension of 300 cubits, 30 cubits, and what would be called a beam, or the width of the ship being 50 cubits. Now, what does that convert to? Well, a cubit, ironically, is from the tip of your finger to your elbow. And so my little model is a cubit long. And so that was a unit of measurement. To convert it to feet, it converts to 450 feet. And I don't have before me the conversion in meters. But here is this floating barge. notice that in the biblical description, and we ought to refer back to the Bible for this. Why not? Since we're saying that it's a accurate document. In this New Living Translation, it says, Genesis 6:14, build a large boat from cypress wood. Now, I disagree with that. It's called gopher wood. Nobody knows what gopher wood is. Some people think it's cypress, but who knows? And waterproof it with tar inside and out. Then construct decks and stalls throughout its interior. That's a good translation. Make the boat 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Now, they do convert it to meters here. I can give this to you. 300 cubits is about 140 meters. 50 cubits, about 23 meters. And 30 cubits, obviously, would be 1/10 of the other number. So it would be about 13 meters. So for the international types that are watching the World Cup, I think it ended today maybe, that would be called a football pitch in international vocabulary. In the U.S., we call it soccer. It's actually quite huge. The soccer pitch is much bigger than a U.S. football field. But at any rate, let's go back to the model, because we could go on and on about this. What is interesting about this model? I live an hour's drive from the Mississippi River. Two of our children live another hour past that in Mississippi. So we're constantly going past the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, Mississippi. And until the great drought of 2022, there was enough water there in that part of the Mississippi that barges could go through. Now, the water's so low now that the barges can't get through. But when they did go through, I used to enjoy watching them. These barges are this shape because they carry cargo, and they have a boat that pushes them along upriver and downriver. Noah's Ark was intended to float. It didn't need a sail. It didn't need a rudder. It needed only God's guiding hand to take it where it needed to be at the end. People have argued, this boat would be unstable. If Mrs. McQueen would allow me, I would bring one of these small swimming pools my grandchildren use and fill it with water here in the kitchen, and then put the model down in and pick up my computer and show you the floor and watch the thing float. But Ms. McQueen draws the line at certain things. But trust me that if you made one of these yourself and put it in a little child's wading pool, that you could push and shove and make the waves as big as you wanted to, and it would not flip over. It's a stable configuration. Why? Because the ratio is 300 to 30, which is 1 to 10. That's the same ratio of Mississippi River barges. And so to answer your question is, if we did this and we made a 450 foot long boat, we could make the rest of the dimensions match, and we would have one of the most stable places to put Noah's zoo. Back to you, Donny.
Very good, Professor McQueen. What are your thoughts on this? Comes in from Stephen Tibbetts. His thoughts on it are, if we could find fresh pre-flood gopher wood, we might be able to build an ark. Otherwise, it might not be strong enough wood. So this is his specific input. What are your thoughts on that, David?
Stephen, a very good point. Next year, yet another American team is going to go to Eastern Turkey to look for what are by now probably the broken remains of Noah's Ark. Can't go into it tonight, but essentially, put your hands on the monitor screen and trust me on this. No, it's a joke there. The idea is the current research involves the idea that the ark was broken into 3 parts and moved down from the 17,000 foot summit of Ararat down to lower elevations. There's a team going over where there is a report of individuals on the ark, not on the ark, but on the mountain, Kurdish freedom fighters, I'll call them, that actually use the ark as a base. They open the door. They lay their maps out on the same tables that Noah probably laid out what he wrote about the ark. So there are some that feel that we really can get a piece of the wood of the ark, but whatever it turns out to be, it's probably a pre-flood tree that's extinct now. With our modern technology, we could certainly take a wooden ship like this and put pitch on the outside and the inside. One of the fascinating things that modern ark researchers point out is, why double cover it like that? Wouldn't it have been waterproofed enough if you just put the pitch on the outside? Some writers think that it was put on the inside too, to preserve it until the last days as one final testimony. The leadership of National Geographic back in the 1920s, 1930s, they were asked, what would be the most amazing National Geographic expedition? And their answer was, if we find remnants of a ship at 17,000 feet or 14,000 feet in the mountains of Ararat, that would prove the truth of the Bible and would change the world's paradigm. Now, this is not coming from a group of people that love the Bible necessarily. These are the leadership of National Geographic Society that could honestly point to what would be the most remarkable archaeological find.
Very good, David. Looks like we managed to get 2 hours out of this open mic discussion. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been very engaging with the audience and also with Grayson, who did join, and I appreciate that. So Professor McQueen, why don't we give you a 5-minute closing here to kind of sum up your thoughts and points, and great job tonight, David.
And I want to return briefly to Grayson. Do contact him, and in late January, we ought to set up a debate, the two of us. Okay, how does a grandfather like me that's got 10 grandchildren and 4 adult children, all of whom are going to come in, and I think they'll be like the animals coming to the ark 2 by 2, coming to my house for Christmas. I think we're going to have 4 or 5 Christmas celebrations because of the busyness of their lives. How would a grandpa like me even begin to summarize what we've talked about tonight in all these different aspects? Well, let's go to a passage that you might not immediately associate with this. And this is Jeremiah chapter 32, and we'll begin with verse 17, again reading from the New Living Translation. O sovereign Lord, you made the heavens and the earth by your strong hand and powerful arm. Nothing is too hard for you. You show unfailing love to thousands, but you also bring the consequences of one generation's sin upon the next. You are the great and powerful God, the Lord of heaven's armies. Now think about that and ponder that at our Christmas time here. You, O sovereign Lord, made the heavens and the earth by your strong hand. Nothing is too hard for you. obviously, we brought up things tonight like the relative absence of human fossils in the record, certain problematic things about what at least the evolutionary community, like Jason represents, certain problematical areas of understanding how we get from Ediacara farm fossils to, thank you, Born Again, to Cambrian fossils. And so these are very important points. Now, as a man who turned 70 this year, and because of Mrs. McQueen's patience, was able to celebrate my 50th wedding anniversary, I'll make some summary comments of things that I worry about concerning my 10 grandchildren, which range from a soon-to-be 16-year-old teenager down to a baby of 4 months old. As I think about those 10 grandchildren, I worry. Why do I worry? Well, I know that God shows love to thousands, but notice what he says, Jeremiah 32, you also bring the consequences of one generation's sin upon the next. I worry that the invention that my generation gave the world, using essentially slide rules, yellow legal pads, and pencils with erasers on the end of them, I worry that the invention of the telephone, which led to the cell phone, which led to the internet, which led to the home computers, and then the most dangerous of all possessions, I even have one, a smartphone. I freely confess that I'm a sinner and that I have needed and still need the grace of the Lord Jesus. As a 16-year-old young man in high school, could I get in trouble? Oh, of course I could. And I did, especially in my case, the sin of pride. But I had to go to a lot of trouble, actually, to find what in my day were called blue movies. They were called that because they had to be pirated. Nobody in 1960 was allowed to look at a woman without her blouse on. You had to go to the library and look up National Geographics of women in Africa or something before you could actually see that sort of thing. But you couldn't see it at the movies. You had to go to a lot of trouble. You had to go to places that were in the bad part of town. My fear is that this generation can lose their innocence with a knowledgeable buddy from high school helping them within 10 or 20 minutes. And they can see what was described in this pre-flood world. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth and saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. Anybody that stumbled into the wrong place on one of these know that there are people who imagine bad things consistently, which are totally evil. So how do we turn this around? We have to go in a circle back to the Lord Jesus Christ. We have to understand that it's the Lord Jesus that is the creator. And before I got on Standing for Truth, I would say the creator and the savior and the coming king. But Donny and the team have made me sensitive to the fact that he is the creator. But by the time of the fall of man, and certainly by the time of the great flood, he is the offended creator. that requires a judgment. It's hard to think of the babe in the manger and associate that with the judgment of hell. But it is an important intellectual circle to walk around, that the same Jesus that was a babe in a manger, we celebrate at Christmas time, was flogged and crucified because he spoke the truth. Do we stand for truth the way that this website is set up to do? My encouragement would be for during this Christmas time, in the middle of the presents and the children and the grandchildren and the Christmas tree, that you ponder the issue of judgment and the glory of God's salvation through Christ. Thank you for this opportunity, Donny.
Very well said, Professor David McQueen. It's always a pleasure. Lots of people giving positive feedback in the chat. And David, I look forward to the rescheduled debate between you and Ryan on Noah's Ark. Always a fun topic.
That'll be a very important issue. I'll bid good night to you, and I'll do like George Bond has always taught me. I am out of here.
God bless, brother. God bless. Okay, so real quick, guys, before I wrap it up, I wanted to make one final point on the conversation that was taking place between me and Grayson. We had to cut it there at the hour and 45-minute mark, roughly, just to wrap everything up. And so I do hope Grayson and I continue this specific discussion on the fossil record, the ordering of the fossil record. And so if Grayson's listening, of course, take note of what I have to say. And I am sure he's not going to tap out. He'll have some objections. And so we'll have to continue our ongoing debate. And if anybody who's not yet seen Grayson and myself, our debate series so far, we've done 2 formal ones and 1 impromptu one, mostly on genetics and ancestry. So please do check that out. Now, I was pointing out that according to the global flood model, God would have created 2 people, Adam and Eve. Okay. He would have created billions of animals. And so what we would expect in the fossil record, we'd expect to find billions of animal fossils, mostly marine. That's what we find, and very few to little human fossils. Now, I understand there are some anomalies that we could debate all day. For example, with the Ashley phosphates beds, and there's been, other examples of possible human fossils in what we would consider pre-flood rock. But I don't think it's conclusive enough to be dogmatic on it. So overall, I would argue that from the biblical starting point, we wouldn't really expect to find a ton of human fossils versus animal fossils. I want to go over a couple articles here that I do have. But firstly, and as we were discussing, I would explain the ordering of the fossil record being based on communities and ecosystems. Mike Ord and I have talked about this extensively in our programs that we've done together. And so basically the ordering of the fossils is the burial order of the flood in terms of the communities that existed in the pre-flood world at the time of the flood. Okay, so the flood begins in the oceans. You have the fountains of the great deep, they break open, and you've got the ripping up of all of those marine creatures that results in their burial on the continents. Okay, so they would obviously be the first creatures to be buried. And as the flood waters rose higher, you get the burial of the land animals. And this is exactly what we'd find. We'd expect to find humans on the top if we found them at all, but we do mostly find human fossils in post-flood rock. And typically those are examples of isolated people groups like Neanderthals. Another important point to consider as well is those looking for the fossils, they have your uniformitarian scientists or your actualist scientists. They believe that the geologic column, and as it is portrayed in the textbook, is an accurate representation of geologic time. and the history of this planet, essentially. And so when they look to layers like the Precambrian, the Cambrian, up to the Devonian, the Pennsylvanian, the Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic, okay, up to, let's say, the Cretaceous, we would say that the post-flood boundary is late Cenozoic, but it would be variable. We did a whole show on that yesterday with Mike Ord. So the point is, they're not going to be expecting to find certain organisms in those layers. They're not going to be expecting to find, let's say, mammal fossils, where basically we find mammal fossils in the tertiary or the quaternary, basically in the Cenozoic layers. Okay, so they're not going to be expecting to find mammals in the Devonian, let's say, or the Cambrian, right? They believe in a good acronym to remember this by is FARM: fish, amphibian, reptiles, mammals, and then higher mammals like humans would basically be at the top, because they believed we evolved last. Now, fossils in general, I'd like to read through this, because I was pointing out that we have, in terms of fossils, when you look to some of these apex predators like Grayson was talking about, well, notice this when it comes to T-Rex. According to the evolutionary model, about 2.5 billion individuals have existed in terms of T-Rex. But notice this, only 32 adult T-Rex have been discovered as fossils. See, a lot of people, they erroneously believe, unfortunately, it's kind of the way that it's pushed, but they believe that we've just got these whole skeletons and all of these representations of these specific creatures, like, you know, the T-Rex and various other dinosaurs. When in fact, we actually have very few. The fossils very fragmented, and fossils are fickle. And that's why they can basically sing any song that you want them to. And so the fossil record accounts for just 1 in about every 80 million T-Rex. 1 in 80 million. This means that the chances of being fossilized, even for one of the largest ever carnivores, were vanishingly small. So picture humans. If you have roughly 100 million humans at the time of the flood, with billions of animals around the globe at that time, let's say the pre-flood supercontinent, then you're going to expect many examples of those creatures being buried and manifested as fossils for us to dig up today, but very few to little human fossils. Notice this, these numbers suggest that fossils in general are exceedingly rare, and hint that many species that were much less widespread than T-Rex were probably never preserved. Just because something existed, let's say humans at the time of the flood, just because they existed, let's say there was 100 million, even up to 1 billion, if you want to go with certain models. But it seems to me that based on Genesis, leading up to the flood, the entire world was filled with violence, with murder, with wickedness. Every single thought of every single man, for the most part, was wickedness. And so I find it hard to believe that people at the time of the flood were being fruitful and multiplying. That was God's command, to be fruitful and multiply. That was his command after the flood. And so if man was in disobedience, man was in sin, man was wicked, then I highly doubt that they were fulfilling that command to be fruitful and multiply. And if the world was filled with murder and death and wickedness and sin, then chances are your population would be lower than one would assume. And so the population could have been at roughly 100 million. And given the fact that you have different ecosystems, you have different communities in the pre-flood world, different elevations, right? A river flows out of Eden. We know that rivers flow downhill. And so Eden would be at a higher elevation. Humans were probably at higher elevations, living in different communities than your dinosaurs. You don't want to live next door to a bear today. You don't want to live next door to a T-Rex in the pre-flood world. That's for sure. Over here, Spinosaurus, some of people's favorite, but one of my favorite dinosaurs is the Spinosaurus. But if you actually look into it, there's been very few Spinosaurus fossils found. There's really only been a few, and everything that they know about the Spinosaurus is based on just a few fragments. Notice this. So if we go here, take us right to this quote that I wanted to. However, despite its popularity, scientists know little about the Spinosaurus. Its fossils have proven nearly impossible to find. To date, archaeologists have only uncovered 7 such fossils. 7 such fossils. These are massive creatures that would have existed in the pre-flood world, and only a few of them, fragments of them, are being fossilized. Your megalodon, again, it's just based on, a few teeth, and then they extrapolate out from there because they know how big a great white shark's tooth is today versus, and then they find these massive teeth in the fossil record, and basically they extrapolate that correctly, I would say, to mean that, okay, we had these massive sharks, these megalodons that reach 80 to 100 feet. So my whole point is the fossil record, it's fragmented. It's difficult and rare to preserve a fossil in the first place. And so it's like finding a needle in a haystack when it comes to pre-flood human fossils. But when it comes to the immediate post-flood world, where you have people groups spreading out in all parts of the globe, for example, these isolated cases with Neanderthalensis, with Naledi, Floresiensis on the island of Flores, with Hobbit, yeah, we're going to expect those to be fossilized given their conditions, given the environment. That's what we find. We do find some really solid examples of fossilized humans post-flood. So I just wanted to point that out and just show you from a couple of articles that, yes, a lot of these even larger creatures, these larger apex predators that existed in the fossil record, you can find article after article that points out that, hey, we've really only found a few of these fossils. We only know what we know about these creatures like T-Rex, Spinosaurus, so on and so forth. You just name it and look into it. Everything that they tell you about it is basically based on just a few fossil finds. So I just wanted to point that out. Let me check the chat here. Okay, it looks like we still do have yes, Dave says we find, T-Rex fossils, and therefore that demonstrates they existed in a population. I completely agree. That demonstrates they existed in a population. We know humans existed in a population in the pre-flood world. The question is, how large was the population? Because if it was relatively small, and we have burial by communities and ecosystems and habitats, we could also look to mobility, intelligence. I think these things are lesser a factor compared to burial by communities. The question is, who's looking? If you're finding a fragment, let's say in the Devonian or the Permian or the Jurassic, if it's actually a small fragment of a human fossil, okay, the uniformitarian scientists going into these fossil finds and analyzing these fossils, the last thing they're going to believe is that that's a human fragment. And so it's going to be misinterpreted as something else, or it's not going to be interpreted at all. It's just going to be thrown into a wastebasket, and as a wastebasket taxon. So the question is, who's looking into it? What are the basic assumptions behind it? Because it is going to come down to models and worldviews. And that's why I wanted to point out that according to the biblical model, God creates two people, Adam and Eve. By the time of the flood, I think humans, population-wise, were probably a lot lower than a lot of people would think. But you would have animals spread out all across the globe. God created animals in populations in fully working and functional ecosystems. And as compared to human beings, you have two people. And so that is reflected in the fossil record. That is basically what we find, is a lot of animal fossils, billions and billions of dead things buried in sedimentary layers laid down across the earth, as Ken Ham likes to say. Okay, so I want to real quick just give a couple reminders. We do have this big debate. I'm looking forward to this one. The Great Baptism Debate. Is the Lutheran doctrine of baptism biblical? Jeremiah Nortier and Mark Gageton. So this is going to be tomorrow. We don't have anything scheduled. And we have, this is Friday. On Saturday, we've got the Great Age of the Earth debate, T-Rock and Marguerite. We basically have shows every single day, except for this Sunday, which I may take as the day that I start my new Separate Ancestry series. I got a lot of great information and data and evidence for you guys. So I am excited. I am pumped. Okay, so we got this one Saturday. Basically, every single day we have a show right up till the 22nd or 23rd. So what I'm doing is, it's been a busy year. We've put out a ton of content. I've been doing a ton of work behind the scenes. We released several books, so what I want to do is to kind of rejuvenate, as one could say. We're going to take a bit of a holiday break. So we're going to take a break from the 23rd, the 24th, Christmas Eve, the 25th, and the 26th. So, we are Standing for Truth Ministries. We're going to take those 4 days off. to basically rejuvenate, spend some time with the family. And leading up to that, though, the last several days, I've sent out dozens of emails, and I am now booking shows basically into the end of February. And then we've got March coming up too. So it's going to be an epic year. And so you won't see anything scheduled for those 4 days, although there could definitely be something impromptu later at night during one of those days. But those days are off in terms of events, and that is intentional. So you'll see nothing scheduled from the 23rd to about the 26th, and then we'll be back on the 27th, because we do have a debate scheduled with Kent. The Evolution Debate Challenge series continues the 20th and the 27th. This one's on the 20th. This is Kent versus Kennedy. And then on the 27th, it is Kent versus Evan. And then, boom, 2022 kicks off right. We got an epic debate on eschatology. We're going to be having an awesome informal discussion on the King James only controversy and Bible translations. And if you're subscribed, just check the event section and you will see all of the events that are currently scheduled on the channel. And we have quite a bit of interviews, discussions, lectures, debates, and all that fun stuff for you. So with that, I think that's pretty much it that I wanted to cover. Great to see that at the 2.5 hour mark, we still got 61 people here, but I am going to wrap it up. This has been a fun open mic discussion. We have rescheduled Ryan versus David, though, so it will probably be at the end of December. So with that, guys, God bless. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for all your questions. Very lively chat tonight as well. There were some questions and topics brought up that made for a lively chat. Admittedly, I probably spend a little too much time in the chat when I do my best to make sure I'm moderating the discussion as needed. But I will say Grayson and Professor McQueen, always easy to moderate, always professional, and always sophisticated. So with that, guys, God bless. And Standing for Truth is out.